Hello and welcome to our commentary on The Chosen. I'm Dr. Scott Hefelfinger, and I'm joined here by my good friend, Dr. Michael Barber, and we both serve on the faculty of the Augustine Institute Graduate School of Theology. It's so great to be here with you. We are working through many episodes of The Chosen, and here we are in Season 2, Episode 3, which has a kind of interesting title.
Matt 424, which is,
Matt.
Yes, Matt. It's obviously a biblical reference there, and I think that's significant. It's showing us that this entire episode is based on one verse in the New Testament, and we see that verse in Matthew 4, so let's take a look at that. And I do think it was significant that, if I'm not mistaken, the title is actually Matt 4:24. Is it abbreviated or?
I think it's the full.
Is it the full?
The full Matthew 4:24. Yeah.
Well, what's interesting about the number being included there, of course, is you're being clued into the fact that here you're supposed to look up these particular verses, right? And I do like that The Chosen does this. It calls us back to Scripture. And so what do we see in Matthew 4:24? We read, "So Jesus' fame spread throughout all of Syria, and they brought to him all the sick who had various illnesses and were afflicted with torments, those possessed by demons, those who suffered from seizures and paralytics, and he healed them." And so here we see that The Chosen is offering us a kind of imaginative reflection on what this particular scene would have involved.
Yeah, I kind of wonder, when this episode came out, if you could see sort of like the Google metrics for searches and stuff, if all of a sudden Matthew 4:24 shoots to the top over the course of, a day or a week, that'd be pretty interesting. But one of the, to go back to this verse, it's fascinating, right, that the verse talks about his fame spreading. When you watch the episode, fame and being famous is not how you would characterize either the apostles, his chosen, or Jesus himself, whom we don't see actually until the end of the episode. So it's almost an interesting commentary on what kind of fame we might think about in relation to Jesus. Certainly his reputation was growing, but it wasn't that he was a celebrity, right? Or living in luxury, or
certainly
that kind
not
of fame, right?
Right. And you could translate this as well, like his reputation, right? So, and we're seeing that here. People are coming from afar and they're waiting in long lines. So they've got a kind of imaginative reconstruction of what this would have involved, that there was this long line of people and they were waiting all day. I was struck by the fact that the entire first, 13 minutes of the episode, one cut.
Yeah, we both noticed that. Is quite a striking technique, really, in filmography that they've used here in shooting it, where the camera is carefully choreographed, moving around, catching whoever is speaking. But you notice one of the key features that this enables us to really enjoy.
Yeah, well, it helped us understand how all of this takes place against a backdrop of the sunset, right? So you actually see the sunset in real time in this episode. And of course, that would have taken some practice, some preparation. I'm a bit of a film buff. I'm a big Alfred Hitchcock fan. There's that great movie Rope by Hitchcock. It has a famous has a number of long, extended sequences. It really plays into the atmosphere or to the sensibility of what is happening on screen. And I thought by shooting this episode in this way, it gave a kind of realism to what is happening here.
That was my impression too. And when I was watching it, it took me a little while to become aware. It's one of those things where it's happening and you're kind of like, actually, this has been going on for a while. But so then what I thought about was, it was actually kind of like a stage production where they have a camera on stage as well, moving around, capturing it. Because of course in a staged play or whatever, you don't get to make cuts and do edits and all of these things. So that was neat. That was just kind of a neat thing to see, and with the sunset setting the mood. And I completely agree that it gave it a kind of genuineness or authenticity that added to the scene, because the whole scene is really about what would it have been like as his chosen ones early on in the mystery of his public ministry to kind of think about what is going on. You know, so they're processing so many things that have happened, and you hear stories from their childhood, and you know, the whole thing. I was kind of joking with you. It has a little bit of this character of kind of like the Bible camp fireside chat, and I have to think this kind of inspired, you know, the imagination behind it. So that was kind of amusing, but there is something strikingly real, I guess, about thinking through what does it mean to walk with Jesus, to be with him.
And against the backdrop of this long extended cut. In other words, the realism highlights the way that the disciples would have seen all these things taking place in real time, so to speak, and having to process them. I mean, just on one level, all these people are coming to see Jesus.
Right.
Doesn't happen very often, and you do have to realize that in the first century, population numbers were much smaller than today. So people often forget this, and they fail to realize, you know, feeding 5,000 people that's an astronomical number. I remember I was talking to our dear friend Dr. Christopher Bloom about going to the Holy Land, seeing these places, and realizing how small they are, and what that's like, you know, for pilgrims when they experience the Holy Land in person. Sure. And Dr. Bloom said something to the effect of, you don't really appreciate how Jesus just came and set the whole place on fire. And that is an apt metaphor, right? Yeah. There was just an explosion of interest in what Jesus was doing. So I thought that was a very powerful aspect of this episode. And I like how the disciples are trying to figure out, what is it that we are a part of right now?
That's right. We've got a clip that captures a little bit of it. So let's take a look at that.
I didn't think we'd be spending our time healing. Well, watching him heal. And they'll never stop. The people come, the more they hear about it, and we're just going to be doing this the next 5 years. And we'll never get to the fighting part.
Eager to bring out that wooden sword of yours, are you?
Do you honestly not know what I'm talking about?
I guess I haven't had any expectations. It's probably why it's a little easier for me. I can remember as a little girl hearing about how someone would save us someday, but I don't remember much about it. Why is it you expect a warrior?
Zechariah. For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city will be captured. Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations, as when he fights on a day of battle. On that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which is in front of Jerusalem on the east.
Yes. The Mount of Olives will be split in two from east to west, and half of it will move in all this craziness, but we don't even know when this is going to be.
So we come out of this clip and we saw Philip, for example, when they're citing the scriptures and they're citing Ezekiel, he says something to the effect of all this craziness, right? I like the way that this episode portrayed Jesus' Jewish disciples attempting to put the pieces together. And we recognize that early on in the series, Nicodemus talks about, well, the Messiah would do this or the Messiah would do that. We have to recognize that, as we've talked about, there were very different understandings of what the Messiah would accomplish. And when you start drilling into the various scriptures, you can see why. You can see how it's not abundantly clear. We don't get a sort of journalistic report of what it will be like when the Messiah arrives. And I had to appreciate Philip referring to these prophecies, all this craziness.
Right.
I mean, how are we to get our mind around these amazing visions of the future that aren't entirely, they're not entirely reconcilable on one level. So
yeah,
how are we to make sense of all this?
I know, and I was thinking, it actually was interesting. I thought of, there's a kind of famous line, or it's really more of an argument that Archbishop Fulton Sheen has in his book, The Life of Christ. And he I think he opens it by talking about, there's only one person in history whose coming has been foretold. And this sets Jesus apart. And it's a powerful argument, and it's a great point. But watching this made me realize that you can still say that, but also realize that the foretelling didn't clarify everything in advance, right? It actually is sort of in hindsight,
right.
Which says something about who Jesus is and the role that he plays in fully revealing the Father's plan to us, right? But it is in that way through Christ, in hindsight, that it becomes clearer. And so in a way, the apostles here don't have that hindsight. And so they're wrestling with it. And I like that it's not done, my impression is that there's not a spirit of, kind of opposition or disbelief. It's a very real docility that can question these things. And I think that's a helpful lesson for us too, because faith is not always easy. And as St. John Henry Newman says, 1,000 difficulties do not make a doubt. So there's a difference between doubting and being kind of opposed and rejecting something perhaps, and finding something difficult, but being willing to pursue that question. And that's, I think, what they're kind of embodying.
Right.
here.
Philip says, we don't even know when this will be. And he's referring, I think, in context to a specific prophecy. This is part of the problem, is when Jesus comes, many people imagine, all right, these are the last days in history. The timeline of human history is about to come to an end, because according to the prophets, the resurrection is associated with the last days. And so Jesus rises from the dead. You see in the book of Acts, Peter refers to the last days being fulfilled in Jesus' resurrection. But of course, we recognize that the resurrection of the dead as a group hasn't happened yet. So Jesus ushers in the last days, which are continuing into our own day. And this creates some hermeneutical challenges when we read the scriptures. Which passages are to be understood as being fulfilled in Jesus's day, and how do we understand that they have further fulfillment? And so, of course, Jewish scholars will point out, well, Christians and Jews are both awaiting a Messiah, right? Jews are waiting the first coming of the Messiah, and Christians will say we're waiting the second coming of the Messiah. And how we understand all these scriptures is really based on whether or not we believe in Jesus. Joseph Ratzinger has this great line where he talks about the fact that the identity of Jesus as Christ, Jesus Christ is Lord, is the most basic, most primitive Christian confession, Ratzinger says. There, of course, we affirm Jesus is Christ. And to say Jesus is Christ means that he represents the fullness of hopes that emerge out of the scriptures. So you can't understand who Jesus is apart from the scriptures. At the same time, since he represents the fulfillment of the scriptures, you can't fully understand the scriptures apart from Jesus. And so Richard Hayes, New Testament scholar, talks about the need to read backwards. We start with Christ and then we read backwards. So anyway.
So it's a neat scene where they're processing this. And I think, we can take away, we don't have to have all the answers, right? There's a spirit of inquiry and growth. And I don't have all the answers, Michael. You do, but so anyway. But let's move on. Mary plays a role here, right? Jesus' mother. She's not in every episode, so it's kind of, I find it special as a Catholic when she does show up, and it doesn't mean it's always easy, but it is special. So she shows up, makes an appearance here. She's talking with the disciples. Actually plays a pretty significant role.
Right. It is interesting that she shows up now. I wonder where she's been all this time in the minds of the producers of The Chosen. It's interesting that you have some women like Mary Magdalene or Rhema who have been following Jesus. And following Jesus is taken quite literally as following Jesus geographically from place to place. Some scholars are going to dispute whether or not women would actually travel with Jesus from place to place. Certainly that doesn't mean that there weren't women who would have identified as disciples of Jesus, followers of Jesus. And we know that there were women, for example, we read about them in Luke 8, who would provide for Jesus. But that might, and I think probably means that they provided for Jesus in the specific places that they were. As we see in, for example, John's gospel, Jesus goes to Bethany and then he's with people that he knows. They provide for his needs there. So I'm not sure about Mary following them, but what I do like is the portrayal of Mary's familiarity with the disciples. It's something that you don't think about a lot and you often see missed in TV shows or films based on the life of Christ, which are often done by non-Catholic Christians. So I do appreciate seeing Mary there. And, there's good biblical reasons to think that Jesus's mother would have been known to the disciples. If we can go to the slide here, in Acts, the book of Acts, chapter 1, we read that all the disciples were constantly devoting themselves to prayer together with certain women, including Mary, the mother of Jesus, as well as his brothers. And we've talked about that expression of the brothers of Jesus. But here we see Mary is with the other disciples. She's spending time with them. This doesn't seem like it's out of the ordinary. It's very likely the disciples, I think, knew Jesus' mother. So I did appreciate seeing that here. Other thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, there are some, I think when you look at this scene, so I appreciated this scene. I think just from the get-go, my view is that you can tell that it's not coming from a kind of fully Catholic inspiration or imagination. Okay, no surprise, right? The Chosen is not made by Catholics. And so some of the points here can kind of be taken in a couple of directions. And I think all of them can be taken in a way that's consistent with Catholic views. So I just want to mention pretty briefly a couple of things that could, give rise to some hesitation. In this discussion, Mary's talking with Mary Magdalene, and Mary says that she made mistakes. Now, of course, Catholics believe Mary's immaculately conceived. She was born without original sin and committed no personal sin in her life. But the thing is that mistakes can happen that are not morally culpable. And I would say even the finding of Jesus in the temple, this scene clearly reflects Mary and Joseph learning something. There was, whether you call it a mistake or not is, I think, neither here nor there, but Mary didn't understand what was going on. And that comes out in her motherly, if not panic, at least, urgent concern. And so there's a kind of way that she learns from something that she did. And Jesus, as a child, gives her what sounds at least like a gentle rebuke or teaching. Did you not know that I would be in my Father's house? And so there's a way that mistakes can happen that don't imply sinfulness. And that's how I would take this, that Mary certainly learned things as she went along. Being without sin doesn't mean she never learned anything as a mother. As those of us who have been parents know, there are many, many things that one learns along the way. There's also a line in there where Mary is talking about the birth of Jesus, and she's struck by how vulnerable the baby is. I found this very beautiful because it is kind of easy to think of a Baroque baby, in a kind of manger scene on comfy hay, cozy blankets, perfectly clean, blonde hair. How that happens, you're not sure.
Jewish.
Right. But she highlights that, this was an amazingly vulnerable moment of condescension that we call the incarnation. And so I found that very special to hear about. But she does then go on to say that she and Joseph wondered, is this really the Son of God? Now, if that line means they doubted, that would be a problem because Mary had perfect faith. But I took it as a statement of wonder. Can it be, right? How can it be? Is this really? And then she goes on to say, but we always knew. So again, there's this idea, I think, of wondering, questions, but not doubting. And so I think that can also be understood in line with Catholic teaching there. The one part of it that I struggled with the most, actually, is that Mary sounds a little bit needy to me. Like, well, when he was a boy, he needed me. And now that he's grown, he doesn't need me anymore. And C.S. Lewis has this discussion in his book, The Four Loves, about need love and how even love for another can kind of get contorted or perverted or turned in on ourselves, where we love someone because we want to be needed by them. And I thought it veered a little bit dangerously in that direction. But I think the truth there that we can at least appreciate is there is a real sense of loss, I think, as a child grows up and a parent loses something. And it's always appropriate, or it's always possible for it to be appropriate to mourn a loss, right? The analogy here would be sort of like if somebody dies and we have a great hope that they're in heaven, we might say, well, hopefully we wouldn't, but we could say to the person who's experiencing this loss, oh, no big deal, they're in heaven now. But of course, there is a real loss. We've lost something, and we can mourn that even while knowing something might be for the better. So I would interpret this, ideally in that way, that Mary can mourn a certain kind of loss of a child Jesus, but I wouldn't want to see that as her being really needy for love. So there are some other things we can talk about here, but these are the ways that I think it's helpful, at least for me, to try to think about some of these lines and some of these scenes so that they can be, I think, in accord with how Catholics think about Mary.
Right. And I mean, we can have slightly different views on this, I think, and we do. It's great that, we have different perspectives on this. It seems to me that the producers are going out of their way to try to be in touch with Catholic sensibilities, or at least I should put it this way, to not offend Catholic sensibilities. And I want to just say, as a Catholic, that I appreciate the effort that is being exercised here. I'm not so sure that it's always pulled off well. In this particular case, I do agree with you. I think that this portrayal of Mary here on these various things, probably not the fact that she talks about mistakes. I don't think that's a reference to sin or something like that, disobedience or something like that, even though in our culture, that's the way people hear the word mistakes, right? So I wonder if there was a deliberate choice of that word there. Nonetheless, I do agree with what you said about need love, and I appreciate that. There are some things, though, I do want to highlight that I really liked, and one of them was Mary mentioning that she never really had much money. That's really important. Jesus says in the Gospels that it's more difficult for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter in the kingdom of God. And people have long tried to downplay the power of that statement. You even get people, as you probably know, who have argued that the eye of the needle is actually a gate somewhere in Jerusalem. And that's what Jesus referred to. That is utter nonsense, all right? The reality is Jesus is emphasizing over and over and over again in the Gospels that possessions are not a net positive when it comes to your spiritual life. It's actually a net negative. In fact, possessions, wealth are an obstacle to the kingdom of heaven. And that's an unpopular message to preach. A lot of people who are involved in ministry don't like to talk about that because we don't want to offend people who could be donors or something to that effect. And we also want to accumulate things ourselves. And so I appreciated that emphasis on poverty here. It is consistent with Jesus's message, and it's consistent with what we see in the Gospels. If we can go to the slide here. In the story of the Gospel of Luke, we read about how after Jesus was born, they brought the child Jesus up to the temple for the rites of purification that are required after childbirth. And we read, and they offered a sacrifice according to what is stated in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. That's quoting from Leviticus chapter 12. Now you go back to Leviticus chapter 12, this particular offering, 2 turtle doves, is the offering that you make if you're poor, if you can't afford something else. So this is kind of like the bare minimum. And it shows us that Mary and Joseph really were in poverty. And I think that's helpful for us to feel challenged by, right? Mm-hmm. Do we live that poverty, or are we always looking to acquire new things, to accumulate more possessions? So I appreciate that. I also really liked that Mary mentions Jesus is a hard worker, and she says he gets that after his father. He gets that from Joseph. Of course, we know Jesus was the son of a carpenter. We've talked about this. The word carpenter, tekton, is a common word that's used for a manual laborer. And we see in Sirach, chapter 28, we see this expression used in the Greek version of Sirach. Every carpenter, tekton, and master builder labors by night just as by day. What is a carpenter known for? Working day and night. And in context, the point is they don't have time to study. They don't have leisure time to think big thoughts. And so the fact that Jesus comes from poverty and comes from a man, his assumed father, Joseph, is a day laborer, doesn't fit with the fact that Jesus has this extraordinary knowledge of the scriptures. Where did he get all this, as we read in the Gospels, people will say. So I do want to mention that. One more quick thing. Mary never mentions, she says that they always knew. When did you first know? Well, I always knew. And it just bothers me tremendously. Maybe it shouldn't bother me this much, but if I would think that if the disciples were to ask Mary, she might say, well, an angel of the Lord came to me. And so I'm really surprised that there's no reference here to the story of the Annunciation, which is such a powerful scene in the Gospel of Luke. And of course, Mary knows exactly who the child Jesus is, as we see in the scene. It's puzzling to me that we have a song that often gets sung at Christmas, written by a Protestant composer, Mary, Did You Know? And it's always puzzling to me that people sing the song. I know people like the melody. I know that there are ways to say, well, Mary didn't fully understand at the moment of Jesus' birth that he was divine, okay, or that he was the God of... Well, in Luke 1:35, we read what the angel says. The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow. And the Greek word there, episkiadzo, is really important. It's the term that's used for God overshadowing the tabernacle. So Mary is being identified with the tabernacle. She's being identified in other ways in Luke's gospel with the Ark of the Covenant. And so it's really hard to imagine Jesus is just a human king, given the kind of language that's used here. She's being described in terms of the sanctuary of Israel where God himself dwells. Therefore, the child to be born shall be called Holy, the Son of God. So I wish that this would have got mentioned. And I think you see this a lot in non-Catholic Christian circles, this sort of wonderment at Mary not knowing what's going on. That song, Mary, Did You Know, often gets brought out. And a sort of lack of familiarity, or at least a lack of emphasis on this important, momentous announcement that she received. So I did want to mention that.
I think I figured out why it worked this way. But before I tell you, let's take a quick look at a clip that'll help to show this.
Yes, great.
How did you know? When did you know who he was?
I don't know. We're all tired. Do you really want to hear all that?
Yes. Yes.
Oh. Well, nothing about it was easy. I can tell you that. It wasn't in my hometown. My mother wasn't there. We had no midwife. I don't know if I'm ready to give all the details. Maybe some other time.
Okay, so my solution here is that I actually really like that Mary says she's not quite ready to talk about all the details. Maybe another time.
That's good.
And so that points to Luke recording it, right? And since the Annunciation is in Luke's gospel, Mary's just waiting until that point in time before she refers back.
I see.
I'm just
All
kidding.
right. Okay.
No, I agree with you. It seems like that would be such a momentous thing, right? That, I mean, how would that not forever be emblazoned on your mind and heart, so that when did this begin? How did you know? It would just be when the angel...
I mean, we have no account of the risen Lord appearing to Mary. We have no account of other angels appearing to Mary. After the Annunciation, it seems that she really doesn't get much more in terms of angelic intervention, announcement. Joseph does, but not Mary. And that's not a reflection, I think, at all on her lack of sanctity or holiness. In fact, as you know, you teach spiritual theology here, John of the Cross would say, the deeper you grow in the spiritual life, the less you need spiritual consolations and the less you need those kinds of visions and mystical experiences.
There's a great line that I've heard reported multiple times that St. John of the Cross said along, in this line of thought. I've never actually quite found where he says it, but it's reported that he said, I wouldn't cross the street to see the stigmata. So the supernatural phenomena are not sort of necessary for someone who is advancing and advanced in the spiritual life. The sacraments are, of course, necessary. Prayer is, of course, necessary. These ordinary means. So, yeah.
Now, Mary recalls Jesus' birth, and she says, well, we didn't have a midwife. That's interesting. The chosen producers seem acutely aware of lots of early traditions about who people were. in the earliest traditions, Mary does have a midwife. So I was interested, for example, in the Proto-Evangelium of James, Mary has a midwife.
And these are non-canonical
they're not-
sources,
yeah,
but
these are
they
not-
still inform, you
Right.
know, how we think about.
Right. And the Proto-Evangelium of James have all kinds of has all kinds of details that are just flat out false, right? So we're not going to imagine that's an inspired source. I did like the fact that she goes from talking about how she had to clean off the child Jesus. I liked how that segued later into Jesus coming back after he'd been healing people, and she washes his feet and helps him prepare for bed. And here we, of course, see shades of the Last Supper where Jesus washes other people's feet. And we also imagine that the scene of Jesus being anointed by the woman, you see that in all four Gospels in different ways.
And they even show in a beautiful way, Mary cleans his feet, his hands, and his forehead. And so I think it's an anticipatory kind of sign of the crucifixion, where of course Jesus' hands and feet are pierced with nails, right? And the crown of thorns on his head. And so, yeah, we're jumping here obviously to the end of the episode, but it connects with this early scene with Mary, and it tied it together nicely. And we have some other things to say about that, what it shows about Jesus, but
we'll come back to it.
Yeah. Let's
What
do
did you think of the line where Jesus says to Mary, "What would I do without you?"
Yeah, I mean, so on the one hand, it does connect with Mary's lamentation, let's say, that, he doesn't need me anymore. And so now what would I do without you? It's... So the positive side of it, I think, is that the incarnation means that Jesus does come into the world in the flesh, and because of that, he does have real needs, right? And those needs are an opportunity for others to draw near to him and to serve him and to help him, right? Both in his infancy when he was greatly in need, right? But then continuing on. So that was a good thing. But what did you think about that?
There is a sense where Christ wants us to participate in his ministry. We see this in multiple ways in the New Testament. And it's a really important theme that Jesus wants us to have a share in his work. We're united to him. But we also have to recognize, of course, that God doesn't, strictly speaking, need us. He doesn't need our help. And so it's a delicate thing to kind of suss out. And in presenting the life of Jesus, there are always going to be these challenges. But, for Jesus to say, "What would I do without you?" It sort of lacks the sense that Jesus allows Mary to see him in need, and that Jesus is inviting Mary to help him, not because he is just so desperate, he's so helpless himself, but that he's, in a sense, I like how the Catechism of the Catholic Church puts it, Christ thirsts that we may thirst for him. And so here Jesus is tired so that Mary can tire herself out, in a certain sense, in serving him.
Yeah.
And I would have liked to have seen a little bit more clarity on that. So anyway, it's just a minor criticism. That's not a major criticism.
Yeah, I mean, this might be overly positive, but it reminds me, I have a 2-year-old in the house right now, and he loves to help out. He loves to help out.
Sure, yes.
And so, when we're cooking or baking or doing really anything, and he comes along and he helps out, I might say something to him like, "What would I do without you?" Right? And so in a way that could express a kind of superior position. But I think you're right that the portrayal of Jesus' neediness at that moment doesn't really go in that direction. But maybe that's one way of trying to find a balance through there. Anyway, it's neat to see always these interactions between Mary and Jesus, and to kind of see how they flesh that out, in the storytelling.
And we also have the interactions between the disciples, and they're wondering about how to think about who Jesus is. And Matthew, of course, feels a bit like he's on the outs. He has been away from his Jewish faith and practice. He doesn't know the scriptures as well, so he's going to Philip and the other disciples and asking him to sort of bring him up to speed,
that's
help
right,
him, help him learn the
Give me the
scriptures.
crash course.
Right, exactly. And there was a scene that I'd like to talk about. If we go to clip 3, I'd like to play that clip and then we'll talk about it.
No amount of learning can bring you closer to God or make you more or less precious to Him. He's always right here, right now, with you, for you.
So no amount of learning can bring you closer to God. Now, here's what I would like to say about that. There is a real danger in our culture, all around us, to downplay the importance of truth. You don't really need truth. And a corollary of that is go with your heart, not with your head. You'll hear that often in our culture. Don't overthink things. And so in the church, I see this all the time where people are constantly harping on the danger of quote unquote head knowledge, as if there's some kind of knowledge that is devoid of your mind.
Foot knowledge.
Foot knowledge, there you go, right. And I recognize that there is a danger there in learning. Paul talks about knowledge puffs up, love builds up. Certainly, there's a truth there. But it always seems like the danger is on the one side of the equation. In other words, it's dangerous to learn, and it's almost irrelevant. I used to know a priest who would frequently, in his homilies, disparage theology. Theology is not important. Theology is not necessary. Theology isn't all that significant. That's not the teaching that we find in Scripture. The idea that the mind isn't important. Jesus says the greatest of all the commandments is to love the Lord with all your heart, with all your soul, with all of your mind. And there he actually substitutes the word mind for strength, which is what is in the original Deuteronomic text. And so I just felt like that expression once again. I see this time and time again in the series, this sort of anti-intellectualism, this downplaying of the mind. No amount of learning can bring you closer to God. You almost want to say it's not simply learning that will bring you closer to God, because to be a disciple means changing your mind. To be a disciple means learning, growing in knowledge. You can't love what you don't know. And so Paul says in Romans 12, let's go to the slide, it's one of my favorite verses in the Bible, be transformed by the renewal of your emotions. No, he doesn't say that. Be transformed by the renewal of your minds. And so a lot of people think, well, if I'm on retreat and other people are crying, they've definitely had a powerful experience. That is completely fleeting. Many people experience emotional, have emotional responses to the gospel, to the call to conversion, and it doesn't mean that there's some kind of lasting transformation in their heart. There needs to be this emphasis on the mind. So maybe I'm overreacting to this line. It's coming from a disciple, not from Jesus. I understand that, but I can't help but, again, just shine a spotlight on what I keep seeing pop up.
And full disclosure, we are theologians.
Right.
So, of course,
Right, of course.
We value learning and the mind. And so this won't be a surprise that we think this. But I mean, one analogy that we've talked about at other occasions, where it's kind of like all the learning in the world isn't going to help. When you think about the way that we love ordinary people, mere humans in our lives, we think, I'm sure, firstly of our spouses and our children. It would be the strangest thing to say to your spouse, I'm not interested in learning about you. I'm not interested in your childhood. I don't really want to know you very well. I just want to love you, right? Like, this is just absurd.
Please don't tell me anything more about you.
I know.
I don't want to get confused with all the facts.
Just let me focus on loving you.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. It gets really confusing.
I don't need more head knowledge about you.
I know. And so the idea here is not to be down on the heart or the emotions. It's really, and this is one of the things I love most about our Catholic tradition, is to hold them both together. And by holding them together, to lift them up and to ennoble them, so that there is this this kind of reciprocal way that knowledge and love work together in tandem. And if we lose one or the other, then it's just no good, right? And so keeping them together, that's what we want to see. We've got a lot of other points. Let's kind of fly through these.
We should just go.
Let's take a
quickly here.
look at our next clip here about little James.
These people, they are believing in him and praising him, and don't get me wrong, that's great, but it's because he's healing them, the Samaritans.
Yeah, was pretty much what he said. That's all they needed.
I know. I just don't know how many of them would believe in him if he wasn't healing them.
So here, little James says that it seems that only Jesus is only getting attention from people because they're getting something from him. And I think the exact line is, it's because he's healing them. I just don't know, little James says, how many of them would believe in him if he wasn't healing them.
Yeah.
And of course, this is powerful coming from him.
Exactly, yeah.
Because he himself has, little James, in the Chosen, not in the New Testament, but in the Chosen, he himself has a handicap and so a disability. And so he follows Jesus not because he wants to get something from Jesus, but because he recognizes this is the Messiah. And I think there's an important application to all of us here. Do we follow Jesus simply because we want to get stuff from him? Or do we really love him and follow him because we recognize who he is and what we do? Do we prioritize our gratitude? Do we prioritize thanksgiving? That's what the word Eucharist means, after all. Are we thinking all the time about what we've already received from him? Or do we have our minds and hearts set on more stuff that we hope he'll deliver?
Yeah, it is a beautiful witness that little James in the Chosen gives, right, with his limp, not asking to be healed, and that making him attentive to this. I mean, to watch that develop will be great. To move on, the apostles, as they're talking around the campfire, they seem to have a kind of conflicted relationship with their Jewish heritage, right? And we've got a couple of clips that bring that out. So let's take a look at the first one.
One time, when my parents were asleep, I had meat with cheese, just to see what I was missing. Have you ever done that?
I'd feel too guilty.
You feel guilty about everything. Right after you were born, you said sorry to Ima for causing her pain.
Forget the guilt. I was sick for days. I haven't violated a single food rule since.
I tried pork once.
How?
Well, we were traveling and we were in a Gentile marketplace and I just grabbed a piece.
Really?
Oh, it was marvelous.
So in this clip, we hear them kind of confessing ways that they haven't followed the law. Thomas, does something that's against the law, gets sick, and never breaks the law after that. Thaddeus talks about, well, I ate some pork one time.
Or eating meat and cheese together.
Oh, that's right.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because that isn't specifically condemned in the Bible, but it is based on a biblical principle. But it was striking to me when one of the disciples actually, in reference to all of this, refers to being Jewish as exhausting. Let's take a look at that clip.
I've grown to love being Jewish, and I've grown to love following the law, but it can be exhausting.
Following the law or being Jewish?
Both.
It always has been. Even before the occupation.
Yes, but aren't we used to it by now? Hasn't it made us stronger?
I just have a hard time imagining a first century Jew speaking this way. I'll be completely honest. You look at places like Psalm 119. I almost put the entire psalm on the slides, but I decided not to. No, it's the longest psalm in the Bible, longest chapter in the Bible.
But it's so beautiful. I mean, it's just basically an ode to the law,
Right. I love the law. The law is the light. It's a lamp to my feet, So this idea that you would have Jews in the first century, wow, these laws are so exhausting. I just can't wait till somebody like a Messiah comes and tells us we don't have to do these things anymore. It is incredibly implausible to me.
Yeah, I mean, I liked one line that Mary Magdalene has where she says, basically, well, aren't we used to it? And hasn't it made us stronger?
Okay, but I think in that particular context, she's talking about the Roman occupation, not the law.
Oh, okay. That could be, I guess.
Yeah, I saw that scene too, and I got excited about it. And so I said, aha, that's good. I want to rewind that to make sure that I have that right. And then I realized, no, she was talking about the Roman occupation, that the Roman occupation has made them stronger. Okay. I think. I think. So I actually, there wasn't anything that was consoling about that. Now, as we're talking about the Roman occupation, there is a scene where they're referring to hopes that the Messiah will come and get rid of all the Romans. And Big James actually quotes from a non-biblical book. This is a Jewish work that we know comes to us from the first century, maybe earlier than the first century, most likely, the Psalms of Solomon. And if we go to the slides here, I have the verse that's actually mentioned. All shall be holy, and their king shall be the Lord Messiah. And so James is understanding, Big James is understanding that this is referring to the idea that the Messiah will come only after all the people are finally able to keep all of these, exhausting laws, as they've put it. And Mary Magdalene actually comes back, and she thinks it's actually the reverse, that the Messiah will bring holiness, that it will be because the Messiah comes, because of the Messianic age, that the people will be able to be holy. And there we actually have an allusion, I think, to another principle that you find in Scripture. In Ezekiel chapter 36, God says, I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes and be careful to obey my rules. In context, we hear about the coming of the shepherd king, the coming of the Messiah, the Davidic figure who will rule over all 12 tribes. So the idea is God will put his spirit in his people in the future day, in the Messianic age, and then that will cause the people to be holy. But in all of this, we see what we mentioned already, and that is how difficult it is to put all these pieces together.
Yeah, that's a great passage from Ezekiel. I could talk for a long time about that. But let's go to our last clip, which is just towards the end of the episode, when the tired Jesus returns from his ministry.
Great.
Good night. Ima. Thank you.
I really appreciated this scene. This is one of my favorite scenes in all of The Chosen. Here you see Jesus absolutely exhausted. And I will say, you often see that in depictions of the Passion narrative. You'll see Jesus exhausted. I think of Robert Powell's, it was Robert Powell, right, who played Jesus in Zeffirelli's Jesus of Nazareth. Of course, he looks human, very human, as he's dying in Jesus of Nazareth. You don't normally see Jesus, though, in depictions of him this tired.
Right.
And I really did enjoy that. And it reminded me of various scriptures. It reminded me in particular of the epistle to the Hebrews. Let's go to the slide there. The author there says, we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who in every respect has been tested as we are, yet without sin. I thought this scene did a beautiful job of portraying the lengths to which Jesus went for our salvation, not just in dying on the cross, but the way he gave every ounce of himself. And you hear about what we see in Matthew 4:24, right? That all these people are coming to Jesus, and we don't get the sense that he was locking himself away from them, but he was going out to them and ministering to them, even to the point of exhaustion.
Yeah, no, it's striking to see that. And I have to say, when I see that portrayal of his humanity, that, we've had occasion to talk a couple of times about The Chosen sometimes goes for the approachable Jesus, right? The kind of gentle, something Jesus. And I can handle some of that. I think it's a little overdone sometimes. This is actually a route to show his humanity that I find much more powerful and persuasive.
Yes.
Right. Not so much like Jesus, the nice guy that I can relate to, although I'm sure he was very relatable, right? But Jesus, who emptied himself to the point of physical exhaustion, as all of us have experienced in our humanity, right? That is something that I can relate to in a way more, right? To see his condescension. Another thing that struck me here that I thought was very beautiful was that when he comes back so tired, Mary is the first one to go to him, to serve him. And it's not, terribly surprising, but I just like, they're kind of natural reasons we might expect that. She's his mother, but then also supernatural reasons. She has the greatest degree of charity since she is without sin. And so that she is the first to go and to, minister to the one who ultimately ministers to us is beautiful to see.
Did you get the sense that the disciples were uncomfortable when Jesus came back?
I think so. Well, I think they were convicted because they had been sort of bickering, right? But yeah, there was at first a kind of sense of, like you said, just being not quite sure about this, a little uncomfortable with how wiped out he was.
Exactly. Maybe they've been sitting around the fire and eating and chatting, and Jesus is the one doing all the work, and yet they're the ones who are supposed to be his disciples. But I did get the sense, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I did get the sense that the disciples didn't really know what to do with such a exhausted Jesus, that there was almost a scandal involved with the one who is the Messiah seeming this weak. And it does remind me of the Gospel of John chapter 4, where we read about Jesus journeying to Samaria. And we read in John chapter 4 that the disciples weren't with him. And we read Jesus, this is now on the slide. We read Jesus, tired out by his journey, was sitting by the well. It was about noon. So I think we're supposed to imagine this is the middle of the day. Some people will say, well, the hot Middle Eastern sun, go there, and sometimes of the year, parts of the year, you'll be very cold. So I don't know if I want to emphasize that point. But it was in the middle of the day. He'd already been active. He'd been doing a number of things. Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." And I already alluded to this, but I love the way the Catechism of the Catholic Church interprets this. Jesus thirsts that we might thirst for him. Jesus takes on our humanity, takes on the capability of thirsting so that we can encounter him, that we can come to know him, and that we can, in a sense, respond, right? And give me a drink. Jesus created water out of nothing as God. He surely didn't need this woman to give him a drink, just like he wouldn't need Mary to help clean him off. And yet he allows himself to become so weak so that we can respond to him in faith, so that we can thirst for him. I think that's really powerful. And so I like the way they sort of got to this principle, not with the woman at the well, but with Mary in this scene. Maybe challenged all of us as well to think about the lengths to which Jesus went for our salvation. What are we willing to do for him?
On that remarkable note, we'll close. Thank you for joining us as we continue our way through this commentary on The Chosen. Take care, and God bless.